Welcome to the Pink Mic Podcast. I'm your host, Victoria Oline, and this is a special Feature Friday episode. I am here with two very special gentlemen that I am super grateful and excited to be interviewing today. Reality TV on Hell's Kitchen, several episodes on trading spouses. Zarian Hadley is well versed. He knows all about lighting, cameras, production. He is well versed all throughout the film industry. And now what he's done is personalized that passion to bring forth films for our community and share our stories. So I am super privileged to have Zarian Hadley here with me today. I have Dr. Anthony Dixon, who is a well-renowned world teacher. He's worked with libraries and museums all over. He actually authored the book that we'll be discussing here today, The Black Seminole War. And he is an all-around historian, very versed in this subject. So I'm extremely excited to have him here as well. Gentlemen, welcome, and thank you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So I want to just jump right into it. You know, this is an extremely important project that I myself have been diving more into. And so I'm grateful that we were able to make this connection. If you would just start with giving an overview of the Black Seminole Project that you all are currently working on.
Go ahead, Dixon. I'll leave that to you.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll begin at the beginning. My research has always been on slavery and oppression and a resistance to oppression. And I came across this story, which is actually the story of the first Underground Railroad and how these people developed from Maroon society and Maroon villages and merged with the Seminole Nation and became known as the Black Seminoles. And it was my dissertation. Then later on, I wrote the public history book, Florida's Negro War, Black Seminoles and the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842. And so about a year ago, I was contacted by Zarian, my partner, Zarian Hadley. He told me that he had seen my interview on the Rock Newman show. And I told him, well, get the book, brother, and call me back and let's talk. And he called me back only days later. And he said, we got to make this into a movie. And so we have been on that journey since. And we have decided to make both a documentary as well as a movie. And the movie will be based on the book, and the documentary will focus on the Black Seminole culture from the people and the culture from a regional approach.
Awesome. So you mentioned that you kind of got started when you were diving into the resistance of slavery. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that looks like and what you actually found?
Okay. For this particular story and these people, what we find is that even at the earliest parts of English plantation society, that blacks were running away and absconding from English plantation society, and they were coming down into La Florida. And they were coming at a number such that the King of Spain actually put a decree forward in what we call the Edict of 1693, which basically states that any enslaved person that wishes to run away from the English plantation society and come down into La Florida, they can come and live for free. And so this was the first Underground Railroad, and it came southward, and it came into La Florida, and then it extended itself into the Caribbean. And so this is a remarkable story of self-empowerment, self-reliance, and above all, unity. Because by the time we get to the 1800s and it's no longer the English, it's the Americans, there is an all-out fight because plantation society has convinced the U.S. government by this time that those blacks that were living in Florida and who had been in Florida for generations now, because again, this started in the 1600s,
Right.
That they should all be enslaved and for some returned to slavery. And so you have runaways who were running away and absconding from Florida plantations during this turmoil. You have those that were living in these maroon societies for generations, and then those who had intermingled with Native Americans, to whom we all collectively call the Black Seminoles. And so this is a story of those three groups coming together and unifying and working with Native Americans to resist the encroachment on Native American land, but also to resist enslavement and in some cases re-enslavement. And so again, the major theme and major underlining theme that we want to get across is that this is a story of unity. What can happen when Black people work together? And so I know you said earlier that we'll do it in parts, so I will let you move on with the show, but at some point I would like to really get into that story and people understanding what these people did and how significant it was then and how significant it is now. It shows, it demonstrates to us what we can do when we work together. We can fight all odds when we come together.
Those three groups, you mentioned the Seminoles and the Maroons. Tell us about those groups. Tell us about the differences and what actually identified those groups and how they were able to unite to fight this war so successfully.
Let's start with the Maroons.
Okay.
The Maroons have their roots in what we call Gullah and Gullah Geechee. Geechee, of course, is the language.
Okay.
And so the vast majority of these people who are absconding and coming down into La Florida have traits of Gullah culture.
Okay.
And many of them belong to the Gullah culture. And we are able to identify that through various cultural traits. The primary two are the basket weaving technique that we can trace all the way back to the west coast of Africa, and particularly the Kru people, and also the language, Geechee. And so while these people are absconding and running away over time, as English plantation society began to encroach on Native American land, Native Americans began to come down into La Florida as well. And so they began to live in these villages in close proximity, and they began to intermingle. Now, we see the Geechee language actually going into a diaspora because they began to incorporate some Native American words into Geechee. And now Geechee is basically a mixture of West African languages with English plantation dialect. And so then they included Native American words into it. And so it developed into what we call the Afro-Seminole Creole language, or commonly referred to as what we call the ASC. And it's from the basket weaving technique and the ASC, we are able to identify the migratory patterns of these people.
Wow.
And so you have those blacks that for generations were living and eking out their own existence in the Florida wilderness. And they were doing so again in close proximity to Native American village. Now, what happens with the Native Americans is that you have a lot of these smaller bands that come into La Florida first.
Okay.
You have the Yuchi, the Hittite, parts of even the Cherokee and the Yamasee or Yamasee. It's pronounced both ways in different places. Now, then what happens is that the Creek Nation, which is historically located in Alabama, from North Alabama all the way down into South Alabama and into that Georgia, into that corner where Georgia, Florida, and Alabama meet. And so the Southern Creeks, or what we call the Lower Creeks, they began to actually accept plantation society. They even went so far as to buy and trade enslaved Africans and African Americans. And so the Upper Creeks, those that lived in northern Alabama and primarily in the mountainous regions of Alabama, they began to question the Lower Creeks. And they asked them, why are you accepting plantation society? And for sure, why are you engaging in enslavement and slavery?
Right.
And so they basically say, okay, what is really going on here? We may, go to war with another nation or tribe, and we may take them during war, and then we may take their women and keep their women so we can keep our numbers up. But we certainly do not enslave them and then say that their children and their children's children belong to us.
Right.
And so there's this schism that happens within the Creek Nation. And so the Upper Creeks actually push their way down into La Florida. And when they get into La Florida, they mix with those Native Americans from those smaller tribes and from some of the tribes some of the people within those larger tribes like the Cherokee and the Yamasee.
Okay.
And they create this homogenous group called Seminoles. Now, here's the thing about that. The word Seminole actually goes all the way back to first the Spanish word, meaning Cimarron. Cimarron was actually meant for the blacks. It was a derogatory term called wild beast. So you may ask, why do they have this negative term if they let them come down and live free? Well, the reason is because they didn't do it because they had this empathy for these runaways, or they had this empathy for enslaved people, because of course the Spanish enslaved Africans themselves.
Right.
It was a political move to try to slow down English plantation society, because they understood that the way the English were going to survive and thrive and continue to settle in North America was through plantation society. And so and that plantation society was built upon the idea of a stable African labor supply.
Right.
So they figured if they could lessen and diminish that labor supply, then they could slow down and actually hold up the growth of English plantation society and the overall growth of the English in North America.
Right.
And so then from the word Cimarron, then we have the word Semolina. Now, Semolina is a Creek word that means renegade. And that was the word that they used for those upper Creeks that had broken away and gone down into Florida.
Right.
And that word, again, means renegade. That's why when you see Florida State University, first thing they say is renegade, because that is the original meaning of the word Semolina.
Wow. Okay.
And so the English word for Semolina is Seminole. And so that's how we come to where we are now when we say Seminole.
Right.
And so during this time, right, through this period of time, you had some black who would intermingle with Native Americans. And they would intermingle with Native Americans such that miscegenation and, of course, children were born. And so these are what we call the Black Seminoles.
Okay.
Now, here's the thing about it, though. According to the rules and how they lived, and this is according to Native American culture, in order to belong to a clan, right? You know, we've all heard of them, the Bird Clan, the Bear Clan, Eagle Clan.
Right.
In order to belong to a clan, it had to be through your mother. It was the matrilineal line.
Okay.
And so if your father was a Native American and your mother was black, then you were still really considered part of the Maroon Society.
Okay.
And if your mother was Native American, then you were considered part of the Seminole clan. And so you were pretty much brought up more in Native American culture.
Right.
And so that's the distinction between the two groups.
Okay.
But you have to understand that the bloodlines are still there, because you got an uncle and a grandmama that's in the Maroon village, you got an uncle and a grandmama that's in the Native American village. Right. Either way it goes, whether your mother is Native American and you live with the Seminoles, you still got an aunt, uncle, and granddaddy over there in the Maroon village.
Right.
And vice versa, right? You grow up in the Maroon village, but you still got a grandmama and an uncle and everything else that is a Seminole Native American.
Right.
But we still have that distinction because they made that distinction, right? And so when we get to the early 1800s, and I'm still talking about the distinction between the groups. When we get to the early 1800s, right, and we get to the War of 1812, that's a pivotal time. I always had to remind my students that we, growing up in grade school and all of that, we harp on the American Revolution, but it was actually two wars that America really got established on. It was the American Revolution when they established their independence, but it was the War of 1812 in which the rest of Europe accepted them as independent, or accepted the United States as independent, and then began to send emissaries and ambassadors, and they actually began to go into full trade agreement.
Right.
And so, and the way that really happens, I'll say it quickly, is that in the War of 1812, neither side really wins, right? Because after the American Revolution takes place, the rest of Europe still regarded, even though we were called the United States, the rest of Europe still regarded us as colonies in rebellion, and that at some point England was going to bring us back under authority and get a grip on the situation, right?
Right.
And so when the War of 1812 happens and they go to war again and neither side wins, it's really a tie. But same way it goes between big brother and little brother, and the big bully and the small guy on the schoolyard, right?
Right.
Big brother fights little brother and it's a tie. Little brother holds his own, so the winner goes to the little brother because he held his own, right?
Right. Right.
Same thing here.
Okay.
Same thing on the schoolyard, right? The big guy fights the little guy. It's a tie. Okay, they get a fight to the little guy, right? For holding his own.
Right.
Same thing happens with the War of 1812.
Okay.
And when United States held their own in the War of 1812, then that's when the rest of Europe recognized the United States and then accepted them as their own country and then began to do trade and everything else, treaties and all of that kind of good stuff.
Right.
Now, within the War of 1812, we have what you call the Patriots' War. You really have to get a grip on this one.
Okay.
The Patriots' War was a war fought on ports, shipping ports. That's what they were fighting over, right?
Okay.
Okay. These ports were Tampa, Panama City, Pensacola, Mobile, Biloxi, and New Orleans, right? Because in grade school in American history, they do all of this, you know, talk about New York and they talk about Boston, right?
Right.
But in actuality, these 6 ports, and of course Charleston too, but these 6 ports were actually far more important than New York and Boston and Charleston, because these ports were directly linked to the Caribbean.
Okay.
And at this time, the Caribbean still made all the money. Caribbean and South America.
Right.
They still had the largest plantations. That's where all the money really was in this hemisphere still. And so you have to think about it though. Those ports that I called out were actually all part of La Florida.
Okay.
So it's the audacity of the United States and England to fight over ports that don't even belong to them.
Not surprising.
That is the arrogance. That is the arrogance of Europeans and their descendants, right? Or English and their descendants, right? That they are fighting over ports that don't belong to them technically. But the issue was the Spanish were so weak at this point, the Spanish couldn't do anything about it.
Right, right.
And so after the War of 1812 is over with, 1815, 1816, actually, 1816, right?
Okay.
Plantation Society sends word to Andrew Jackson in New Orleans. And they say, listen, we got a serious problem in Florida. You can't stop there. You got to come further into La Florida. You got to come all the way to the Panhandle. You got to come into this region of Florida, and you have to deal with these people. And these people that they were talking about were all of these blacks, because at the end of the War of 1812, the British, because these Maroons, right, these Florida Maroons, helped the British during the war, because the British, of course, said that they would guarantee their freedom, and they would guarantee safety for them, right? And the British did keep their word. See, that's the thing about it. In the American Revolution, the British offered freedom to fight for them, and the United States offered freedom to fight for them, right? Well, at the end of the American Revolution, many blacks who fought for America, and that's part of the story they'll never tell you, many of those found out that America never meant that. They reneged, and they re-enslaved them.
Wow.
Whereas the British kept their word. And so when we get to the War of 1812, when the British make this agreement again, they accept the British. And so the British again keep their word. And so when the British leave, they actually leave a fort to the blacks. They left them a fort and they left them ammunition. And said, there's nothing else we can do for you. Here's the best we can do. Right? Well, this sent shockwaves throughout plantation society because you got all of these free blacks now living with these and intermingling and living in close proximity to all these Native Americans, to the Seminoles. But by now they are called the Seminoles. And so the issue is, in that time, during that time period, that was a progression, right?
Right.
You have a settlement, you have a colony, and then if you are established that fort, that means you are well on your way to establishing a colony.
Okay.
And so for the plantation society, they were like, listen, that cannot stand. If they have a fort, then they will develop a colony. There will be a full colony of runaways from our plantation system. And as long as our enslaved people know that there's a full black colony down south, then we will never reach our fullest potential because they will always run away. And then the next thing you know, we'll end up with a black nation.
Right.
And so they sent word to Andrew Jackson and said, he must do something. You must destroy this fort. And so Andrew Jackson, without the permission of the United States, without the Secretary of War nor the president's real permission, comes into Florida and he destroys the Negro Fort, which is about 65 miles southwest of Tallahassee.
Okay.
And when he does this, he starts the First Seminole War. And at the end of the First Seminole War, the blacks and the Native and the Seminoles are pushed out of the Panhandle. They're pushed out of Tallahassee. They're pushed out of the Gainesville area and parts of the area over toward Jacksonville, but mainly the Panhandle, Tallahassee, and Gainesville. And they're pushed down into Central Florida, primarily in the Tampa area, but expanding all the way over to the Orlando area in Central Florida.
Okay.
Now, the problem is this land is uninhabitable. It's low-lying, swampy areas. Now, you come to Central Florida now, you go to Lake County, you see all these pristine lakes, and you get to Orlando, got plenty of lakes in Orange County as well. But you can imagine the early 1800s, what it looked like.
Right.
And so they got fed up and they returned to North Florida. And when they returned to North Florida, approximately 10 years later, right? Plantation society was now firmly in place in North Florida because North Florida had very fertile land.
Right.
See, they wanted the land too. They wanted the black out, but they wanted the land. And so this is what brought the Native Americans and the blacks together. So it is after the First Seminole War that we stopped calling them Florida Maroons and we called them all Black Seminoles because they went into a formal agreement.
Right.
Now, when the Second Seminole War starts, right? In the Second Seminole War, the United States wanted to rid themselves of the Seminole Native Americans altogether, right? Because we now had the Indian removal policy, right?
Right.
And as you know, it's Andrew Jackson who institutes the Indian removal policy. He gets those ideas from his time in Florida because after the First Seminole War, he actually becomes the first territorial governor of Florida.
Oh, wow.
And that's where he got the political bug. And he
Mm.
only stayed governor for 9 months because he was appointed, not elected. But by then he was hit with the political bug. He moved to D.C. And of course, the rest is history, right?
Right.
Well, we can see a direct line from the First Seminole War to how Florida becomes a territory.
Right.
Now, the Second Seminole War, they decide that the Native Americans have to go, like I said, but then they also decide, okay, all of these blacks, they got to go back to the plantation. And so they went into another war. And it was the longest, deadliest, and costliest, quote unquote, Native American war ever fought. But the truth of the matter is, even the general who was over the war, Thomas Jessup, writes a letter to Washington, D.C., and he says, this is not an Indian war. This is a Negro war.
Okay, and I'm going to jump in right there because that kind of, I want to bring Zarian in here too, because this is a lot of what you talk about in your book, the Second Seminole War, the largest Negro War. Now, Zarian, I know when you found Dr. Dixon's book, you sped right through it, and just listening to the information that he shared, this history it's rich, it's very deep, it's very profound. So I'm interested to know in reading his book and reading Dr. Dixon's book about the largest Negro War, the Second Seminole War in Florida, what part stood out most to you to really illuminate the need for this particular film?
That's a great question. As I read through the book, I compared it with the movies like Roots that we grew up watching, and we've been so conditioned to a certain type of narrative when it comes to slave movies that we pretty much was brought over here from Africa, and they, forced us into this servitude, enslavement. And let's just stop right there for a second and talk about that. Have you ever seen a slave movie where they're doing that?
They gave us the one, Birth of a Nation with Nat Turner, but that was on a very small scale, and it wasn't the largest, it wasn't the first. No, they are very hesitant to share those stories with us.
Right, it's just when you uncover it, there's like over 250 rebellions, documented rebellions, and I feel like we need to tell our own story. It's because we for so long haven't had the resources to tell our story. The rabbit got the gun now, you know what I'm saying? When it comes to storytelling. So this book to me laid a blueprint out for at least 3 wars that we can talk about. That's verifiable, and the evidence is there. So my imagination began to run on how the story can be told.
Right. Dr. Dixon, you were going to say something when we were talking about the slave revolt and how we don't hear about these stories. Go ahead.
Well, yes, and the problem also is that they control the narrative, right? Now I'll give you a good example. You brought up the Nat Turner movie about Nat Turner, right? Well, one of the most significant things about Nat Turner's story, right, and that rebellion, right, was the dream and the epiphany that he had, right? And the dream included where he saw black angels and things of that nature, and it told him to fight for freedom. They would not put that in the movie, you see? They still control the narrative. Now, that was one of the most important things stressed when you look at the history even through the documents and things of that nature, he talks about this epiphany. Even writers talk about this dream that he has, where he sees black angels.
Mm-hmm.
And God tells him to do some of the things that he does, right?
Right.
Yet they would not put that in the movie.
Right.
Even though that was the cornerstone to the whole rebellion.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that's the thing about it. This movie we are trying to do within the end, we will do within the African American and Black community, financially, as well as marketing, everything else. The book itself, they're not only, we expect not only that they anticipate the movie, but they anticipate the movie because they go get the book.
Right.
And we understand we are doing this, and I told Zarian this when we first got started. We will be trying to make this, because I understand it's a movie, you have to do some cinematography stuff, you have to take some little licenses, little things to make a movie. We understand that.
Right.
But we are going to keep this movie as historically accurate as possible.
Yes.
And in doing so, what that means is this first Underground Railroad was conducted by our ancestors themselves. So there is no, historically, there is no white person that could be a main character.
Right.
There's no white person that it could actually even be a supporting character.
Right.
Now, we do include, because it is historically accurate, we include the abolitionist sentiment that was in Florida. But even the vast majority of the abolitionists saw siding with the blacks and the Native Americans as treason. You see, because the U.S. government had gotten involved now. So if you fight with them, that means you fighting against the U.S. government. That's treason. You see, and they weren't willing to do that.
Right.
Also, what we found is, and not to say he's the only one, because, for every one person you think, there's always somebody else who either did it first or just didn't get the recognition, right? We give Rosa Parks all the recognition, but of course, Claudette Colvin was actually the first one to refuse to give up her seat. And Claudette is still alive and well in New York.
Oh wow!
And so, here again, we know of one abolitionist later on in the war. He doesn't fight, but he does help runaways get away. He helps the enslaved abscond and run away so that they can join the fight and get their freedom.
Right.
And he was caught and he was branded as a slave stealer and branded in his hand. So we do include that sentiment.
Right.
But there was no overarching white savior or anything like that.
Right.
Historically. And so we're not about to put one in there. And so that was the other thing. That was the third part that I didn't say. During the Second Seminole War, you still had those who were running away from the plantation to join join these maroon villages. And like he mentioned earlier, John Caesar himself was a runaway. He became a leader in the maroon village, and he became the go-between between the villages and those still enslaved on the plantation. He would go steal supplies. He would encourage some to run away. He would do all of these things. He was the go-between. And so it's those three components, right? Those who have the Native American mother, who are entrenched in Native American culture now, those who remained in the Maroon village, and those who continue to run away during the war. Because we also know that during the war, those 7 years, which again was the longest quote unquote Indian war, more of our ancestors ran away from Florida plantations than any other period in Florida during Florida plantation time. More ran away during those 7 years than any other time.
And we don't hear about that.
No, and so we are going to tell that story because it is the largest, it is the most successful. And it is because of that relationship with Native Americans that you don't get to hear a lot of it from their side either. And I can tell, I want to take just a brief second to tell you why that is. You hear about Geronimo, you hear about Sitting Bull, you hear about Chief Joseph, you hear about all those other ones, right? But you barely get to hear about Osceola. And the reason is Osceola had a very close connection to the blacks. A very close connection. Most of the warriors in his band were black. His wife, and of course he had more than one, but his wife was black. And she was the reason that the war continued on. They had captured Osceola. They thought the war was about to be over. One of the other people who had gotten captured as well told him, hey, they got your wife. They about to ship your wife out west. He escapes, goes and gets her, and the war continues on.
Wow.
And this is one of the reasons you don't hear about Osceola the way you hear about the other ones. Because you can't tell their story. You can't tell the real truth about them without including the blacks. There's no way.
And that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to change our history in order to change theirs, in order to make it look better, more appealing, if you will, more digestible.
Like they've been saying about all of this backlash about these civil rights pictures and all of that. These people don't want their children and their grandchildren to know who they were in the 60s.
Right.
Plain and simple. They don't want their grandchildren and their children to know who they really were in the 60s. And it's the same thing now.
It's the same thing. They're trying to cover up our history and covering up theirs too. And like you mentioned, to leave out the white savior complex and the white supporting actors, it's not necessarily, it's mainly to tell the story the way it's meant to be told. We all know that they're going to change the narrative to make them look better, but also, like Zarian was saying, to continually enforce the narrative that we are weaker, subservient. We didn't put up any fight. There was no resistance or opposition to it. And so,
and if we did, it's because someone else, quote unquote, led us. It's always blacks in the company of.
Right. As if we can do nothing by ourselves.
On our own.
And so when you talk about the three different groups merging together and that unity, I'd like you to kind of talk about this. And Zarian, you can chime in here too, because, wanting to make this film, wanting to push out the narrative that we do have power in our unity. So I kind of want you all to talk about that, talk about the purpose of not only stressing the unity they had back then and the things they were able to accomplish, but the responsibility and importance of unity now today, fighting a similar fight.
Exactly. I was going to say that, and I'll say a few words and then I'll give it to Brother Zarian.
Okay.
when people leave the movie theater, we want them to get three things out of it:
Okay.
self-reliance, self-empowerment, and unity, right? And unity being the most important out of the three, because these people not only fought for their freedom, they won against the U.S. military, the United States government military, and
Mm-hmm.
all of its might, who had held England off and all of that good stuff.
Right.
They still won to where the United States said, okay, fine. If you agree to go out west with your Native American counterparts, fine. You can go. You can be free. You got your freedom.
Right.
Just go, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so it's that understanding of just how powerful our unification is. You know, when you look at England, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then their ancestor, I mean, not ancestor, but the United States, you understand that they have always used one particular tactic that they have always relied on. They will continue to rely on. And that is divide and conquer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And with us, our lack of unity is our number one nemesis. So when lack of unity is your number one nemesis within yourselves, then you have a group of people who thrive on divide and conquer. That is why it works so well with us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so when we really look at it, right, and we can continue to demonstrate what we can get done when we unify,
Right.
then people, we firmly believe that people will walk out of that movie theater with a sense
Mm-hmm.
that unification is a must. We are going to make sure that unification is the underlying theme throughout the movie. And in the end, we are going to still stress unification.
Right. Right.
Go ahead, Brother Zarian. You take it from there.
All right. So the past 20 years, I've been working on telling our story, just telling something that a lot of people that it resonates.
Well, while we wait for him to come back in, that does lead me to my next question, because you were talking about the major takeaways, the things that it's important. Number one, the reason for this film, but most importantly, the message that you want people to get from the film and the things that you want them to take away. So can you just expound on those things a little bit for us, please?
Okay. First thing, and there are a few things, but first thing is we want to provide a voice to the voiceless, right?
Mm,
In African diaspora studies, I see it as a three-part thing, right? The first thing is to provide a voice to the voiceless.
right.
The second thing is to provide those cultural connections. And then the third thing is to use that information to move forward for progress,
Right.
right? And so the first thing, again, is to provide a voice to the voiceless, tell this story, let people understand how strong our history really is,
Yeah.
that this was the first underground railroad. And like I said, it went into Florida and then it extended itself into the Caribbean. Um, just after the First Seminole War, if you recall, England left them the fort, like I said, and said, that's the best we can do for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, a couple of years later, the general that actually left the fort
Mm-hmm.
felt like they could do more, right?
Mm,
So what he did was he had bought land in the Bahamas,
Mm.
right?
Okay.
And so he took land, some of his land that he bought in the Bahamas, and he made it a safe haven for those Black Seminoles and those blacks
Mm.
who could make their way to the Bahamas. And he actually helped some of them get
Mm.
there.
Oh wow.
And there is still a Black Seminole community there on Andros Island.
Wow.
And so that is one of the important things we'll do with the documentary. We're
Mm.
going to look at the 5 major regions where we have still have strong Black Seminole communities:
Mm-hmm.
Florida, Bahamas, Oklahoma, Texas, and Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we're going to give that overall history of each region, show those cultural connections, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
then talk about them going forward in the future and what they would like to see done in the future and how they're going to progress their people. Now,
Okay.
the other thing that we want people to understand and get when they watch this movie,
Mm-hmm.
right? Right? We want to first tell the story. We want to provide this historical accuracy on the first Underground Railroad
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because that is important. It is important to know that we sought our own freedom first and we gained our own freedom first.
Yes.
And more gained their freedom during this Underground Railroad than they did with the one the whites were primarily in control of for a
Mm-hmm.
period of time. Because they didn't control it the whole time, but of course they were in control for a period of time. And then, just as a side note, even the third Underground Railroad,
Mm-hmm.
which went primarily from Texas and Louisiana and a little bit of southern part of Arkansas into Mexico and into to Belize.
Okay.
And this is why Belize to this day still does not have an extradition treaty with the United States.
Wow.
Most people don't know that.
No.
It comes from the fact that third Underground Railroad, Belize became a safe haven for them. And they refused to go into an extradition treaty to
Hmm.
allow enslaved catchers, and planters to chase these people and bring them back to the United States.
Wow.
Now, another point that we want to get,
Mm-hmm.
all right, is to look at the cultural connections, right? The
Okay.
culture. People are going to identify some part of their culture
Mm-hmm.
from this movie,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because we're going to look at the origins, which is Gullah culture.
Mm-hmm.
So the ideas of rice and foodways,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? And crops, the basket weaving technique. They're going to realize, hey, I've seen one of those baskets before. That's what they call them, the Gullah baskets. I've seen
Mm-hmm.
those, that kind of thing.
Right.
And then there are going to be things within that we are keeping within the general African American culture that came out of our enslavement period.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are going to be cultural things that every black in that movie theater is going to be able to identify with.
I love
They
that.
may not be able to identify everything or even understand because we will have some Gullah dialect, some Geechee dialect in the movie, some
Mm-hmm.
ASC dialect in the movie. So they
Mm-hmm.
may not be able to understand that part, but there will be some part about our culture that they are going to be able to identify with. Now, I want to give you a quick story.
Yes.
I've had a friend since undergrad. So that means we've been friends 30 years now,
Oh, wow.
right?
Okay.
When he went to the website and he saw what we were doing with the project, he sent me a message.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "Hey, man, did you know I never told you?" He was like, "That's actually how my family got to Florida." He was
Mm.
like, "My grandfather, he was like great, 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 great. He was like great, great, great grandfather
Mm-hmm.
was enslaved during the Civil War.
Mm.
But by that time, everyone knew that you can come to Florida and hide out,
Mm-hmm.
right?"
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So his because Florida was already known as a safe haven.
Right.
And so his grandfather left Alabama, came into Florida, hid out in Florida for the entire Civil War. Then, when the war was over, he went back to Alabama, got his family, and brought them to Florida. And their family had been in Florida since. And that's how their family got to Florida. You
That
see,
is so
so
amazing.
they may not have been Black Seminole,
Mm-hmm.
may not have been Maroon, they may not have escaped from a Florida plantation, but
Mm-hmm.
everyone will be able to
Yeah.
find some part of this story that they can connect.
Mm-hmm. And that's going
It's,
to account for that empowerment feeling that people are going to have by
yes,
being able
that
to
was,
identify.
and that's what I was getting to, right? The last three things I said, right?
Mm-hmm.
Self reliance,
Mm-hmm.
self empowerment,
Mm-hmm.
and then again,
Communication.
always stressing the unity.
Yes.
And they're going to walk out of that movie theater with all three of those things.
Yes.
This movie will move you. It is going to move you. It is going to have your children asking you questions that are going to move you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It
This is
is
the way.
going to have you looking at our history differently and
That's
what they have been telling us
yes.
and
This is how
teaching
we
us.
rewrite our own history. Stories like this. This is
Because it
how we
is
take back our
our
power.
responsibility and our duty.
Yes.
We cannot get upset when they don't tell the story right because it's not their story to tell to begin with.
And
You
like
know,
you said, they don't want to make themselves look as bad as it really was. So they're never going to tell it accurately. And when you talk about it being the largest revolt that they didn't have anything to do with, if they're not involved, they're not going to tell about any way we were able to unite and overcome. Because again, that speaks to our empowerment, but it also takes away their white savior complex. As if, again, they have to start everything. They have to be at the forefront and the leaders of everything.
because blacks are in the company of everybody. We don't do anything on our own.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody leads us. See, and
Right.
that's the whole narrative that even Florida historians have put that the Black Seminoles were led by the Native Americans. And we
Right.
know that's not true. Like I said, even in the documents, they say this is not an Indian war, it's a Negro war. We got other documents from other soldiers,
Mm.
like captains and whatnot, that are saying these people are not enslaved. One of them even went so far as to say Indians don't rule them, they rule the Indians. They
Mm.
tell the Indians what to do. They're the ones who are fighting the hardest.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We have those documents, you know?
Wow.
And so I've had intellectual, whatever, academia, whatever you want to call it, with other Florida historians, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because what happens is when they burn the Negro fort down, right? Andrew Jackson turns northward and he goes to a very large Native American village, right?
Mm.
And
Okay.
he burns that village down too.
Mm.
And so most Florida historians will say that's when the Florida First Seminole War begins, right?
Mm.
But we have document proof where the Native American Seminoles themselves said that they were going to get revenge for the burning of the Negro Fort because they used it as well. It was a way station for them. They traded there. They
Mm,
stayed there. You
okay.
see?
Okay. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when the Negro War, I mean, when the Negro Fort is burned down, that is what starts the First Seminole War. But they want to wait till he goes a week later and burns down the Native American and say, no, that's when it started. You see,
Right.
because it's always blacks in the company.
Mm-hmm. 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 And that's all right though. That's all right because this is just a ripple to create the wave. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
These types of stories, like you said, it's our duty and responsibility because they're not going to do it for us. But our children, the future generations, are dependent upon us to tell these stories, not only to empower them mentally, but physically and emotionally, so that they
yeah,
can understand that they are much bigger than what the white man would show them that they are or try to tell them that they, and that we come from greatness. There's greatness all up and through each and every one of us. It's just a matter of what have we been told and what are we now believing about ourselves.
right.
So
Because
that is amazing.
everything given to us is negative now.
Right,
It's just it's negative. Even if it's outright lies, it's negative.
right,
You
right.
know,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
some of
And
it is outright lies. They don't care as long as it fits that negative narrative.
right, right. Right. And so that is why I am so grateful for you, Dr. Anthony Dixon, and for Zarian Hadley. I know he had to jump off, but I'm extremely grateful for not just your passion behind this, but like you said, that word duty, that word responsibility, it puts a different type of momentum behind you when you really feel responsible, not like it's something that you're just doing out of a hobby or something recreational, but this is something that you literally feel obligated, charged to do. And so I'm grateful again for your time. I'm grateful for all of your information. I'm grateful for you writing this book and now turning it into a film to empower people like me, my peers, our community. And so I would love to have you back. I know we've been going for a little while now, but I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into not only your book, but specifically the 7-year Seminole War, the things
Okay.
that transpired in it, and in the ending time, like what was the resolution, the resolve, and how did it end? And like you mentioned, the 5 different regions, what sort of things they're demanding now. So if you're open to it, I would love to continue this for an additional part. Um,
Yes, I would love to come back.
okay, perfect, perfect, perfect. Because I'm excited. I've taken more notes this time on top of the 5.5 pages I took in our first conversation. So I mean, I'm so grateful. These types of things need to be in the history books, and it's unfortunate that they're not. These types of things. I'm 40 years old. I'm just now learning about all of the things that were hidden that I didn't even know to look deeper into.
Can I say something about that?
Yes, please.
Okay. Truth of the matter is, right? I had to go all the way to graduate school and the highest level of graduate school to get to this information,
Mm,
right? And it is one of the reasons I am a public historian, because not only did I get the PhD in history, but I also was in library science, special collection and archives,
mm,
because they keep our information.
mm-hmm.
And they don't just keep our information because they claim that that's the safest place. They keep our information because they do wish to keep it from us.
Mm,
Because in doing so,
mm,
it ensures that they remain the dominant culture.
right.
And so I feel like it is my duty, because I was privy and I was privileged to get to that level
Mm-hmm.
where not only was I able to gain access to those documents and gain access to, because it's not just about the documents, right?
Right.
It's about knowing how to get to them. right?
Mm-hmm.
Being able to be in a position
Right.
to acquire those documents.
Right.
Because archives now get to the point where when you fill out your sheets and your research, they want to know why you want this particular information, why you want this, what's the purpose, you see?
Wow.
Yes. And so they are deciding what you can and can't get to. But like I said, because I have gotten to that level where I can simply say I'm doing research on this, I'm doing research on that. I know that this is here, I know that that is there. It kind of gives me more access.
Right.
But it's not guaranteed.
Right.
Not the way we think. We are moving better. And I give you an example. One of my former students is now one of only 12 African Americans who are an archivist at the National Archives. One of only 12.
Wow.
You see, and we're going to keep changing that number. Because this is how we get in there and get to that access.
Right.
And the more we become involved, the more I share what I know, the more other people can go to their state libraries, their state museums, their state archives, and say, I want to see this, I want to see that.
Right.
Oh, I know that this is here. I know that that is here. And in some cases, they're going to be able to tell them the box in the file folder that is in. So don't tell us it's not there.
Right. Because that's what I'm thinking, living right here in Washington, D.C. They've got the archives museums. They've got the Library of Congress. We've got access to it. So many artifacts and archives are held. The things that they have lied about in the history books are truthfully archived in these museums. And it's amazing. National Museum of Native American History, they talk about that in there. But in the books, in the history books, they make it seem like it was all peaceful and everything was done under some nice treaty, and everyone was communicating well. But then they talk about the Removal Act, and they talk about the betrayal and the outright lies in the archives. So like you mentioned, it's there. It's a matter of telling more of us about what's been hidden so we can go find it for ourselves. And again, to instill that power into us,
And even if you don't go look for yourself, if you rely on people like me and the others who have had privy to this information, which is fine, because we give you the documented sources where we got it from and all of that good stuff in certain areas. Now, in certain books, we like Florida's Negro War, though, that's a public history book, so I just told a story. But if you wanted that background information, you can easily go get my dissertation.
Right.
You can read it, you can get every last source. So if you simply rely on us, then that is fine too, as long as you take that information for empowerment. You share that information. Y'all use that information for the community's good, and everything is
Zarian,
fine.
welcome back. We were just going to close out. I was telling Dr. Dixon that I would definitely have to have you all back for an additional interview so we can dive much deeper into the film, into the project, and just into different ways that we can support. So on that note, I do want to ask the both of you to share different ways that our listeners and our viewers can support this film. You mentioned, just listening to you and using that as empowerment, but if we wanted to be more involved and actually help bring this film to life, what are some ways that people can support this project?
Definitely want them to go to blacksemiноleproject.com.
Yes.
And from there, they can purchase the book. I know once you read the book, then you have a foundational understanding of the research that Dr. Dixon has spent years combining through his research and others who have dedicated a good portion of their educational time spent gaining the knowledge and putting together evidence, reading through journals, diaries from all multiple sides of the story to come up with what's in that book. You know, I will also say sign up so you can be abreast of all of the movements that are being made. You know, right now, I'm actually en route to go to the Seminole Days.
To Seminole Days. And that is where Black Seminoles come together. They fellowship, they meet, they hold tribal meetings, all of that good stuff. And we are headed there. I will meet him there. And we have gotten permission. We've gotten permission from the elders to present the project to them. And we're going to hopefully get the entire Black Seminole Nation support.
Yeah.
We do have several Black Seminoles, those that are popular, those that are from some of the most prominent Black Seminole families, chiefs. We already have their support, and they've given us their support. And so we want to talk to the nation, let them know exactly what we're doing, ask for their support, and we're offering them to be a very strong part of this whole project. Not just for the interviews on the documentary, but be a part of the film as well. If they want to be extras, they can be extras in the movie. We're open to that, to their full involvement. As a matter of fact, we got one who's a good friend of mine. We were in undergrad as well together, and she is a Black Seminole, and she wants to be on both sides, so that's fine with us.
Yeah, that's awesome.
We'll be in there, so that, because to me that strengthens the movie as well, the impact.
Right.
When we actually have Black Seminoles who are portraying their ancestors themselves, you know?
Yes, absolutely. That spirit is going to be powerful. That is so exciting. And so you mentioned that was in Brackettville, Texas.
Yes, Brackettville, Texas. We'll be there from the 15th to the 17th.
Okay. And is that something that they do every year down there?
Yes.
Oh,
it's
wow.
called Seminole Days.
Wow, that is so awesome. So again, Dr. Dixon, I can't thank you enough for your time and your information. I know when we first spoke, you mentioned that you used to teach in the classroom and now you consider yourself a world teacher. Yes. And I'm grateful to be a student. I've been literally since our first conversation, the things that I've learned and that I looked up, I've been having conversations with my peers because too many of us don't know about this story. And it's really unfortunate. It's very disheartening to know some of our history and its power and how we just don't know about it, you know. But when you mention wanting to walk away with that self-empowerment, that self-resilience and that unity, that empowerment word, that right there is just, I'm being flooded with it every time I talk to you and learn more and more and more about the truth of our history of people that look just like me and you. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Dixon. Please support BlackSeminoleProject.com. I will post it in the description box here because this will be on YouTube as well. So we'll make sure we post it in the description box so you all can go donate. You can purchase the book. You can join the community as well, like Zarian was mentioning, to get all of the alerts and updates and just stay abreast to everything that's happening around this film. But most importantly, to support, and start sharing these stories as well. Dr. Dixon, it's been a pleasure. Before we go, if you have any closing remarks.
Well, I think you did a pretty good job, sister. No, in actuality, I want people to join this movement because this movement in the whole process, the project itself, is going to be a testament to unity as well. Yes. Because we're asking the Black community to get behind not just the movie, but the documentary as well, but get behind the movie.
Right.
donate, keep up with us, share the information,
Mm-hmm.
get the book,
Mm-hmm.
get empowered. And then when this movie comes out, know that this is something we did together.
Right.
You know, we did this movie. We didn't wait on someone else to say, okay, we'll do it. You know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
you
Right.
know, 12 Years a Slave was, some people had a problem with that movie, but I thought it was a decent movie. I thought it was a good movie. But the fact of the matter is, we didn't do that movie either. Brad Pitt did that movie and his production company.
Right.
You see?
Right. And there's only so much justice they'll do for our story. You know, there's only so much
Right.
that they'll do. Yeah.
It's our duty.
Right.
You know, it's our duty. You
Yes.
know,
Absolutely. Well, thank you all so much for tuning in. We will be back. I'm definitely going to have Dr. Dixon back here enough because he needs to share more of this with all of you. Some of this, not some, most of this information, if not all of this information, is new to most, to most, if not all of you. I'm almost sure of that, and it's unfortunate, but we are going to change that starting here and now. So thank you again for tuning in to the Pink Mic podcast. Peace, love, and light to you all. Until next time, I bid you adieu.